Hi, this is Greg Osterhaus, and this is Human Physiology for Johnson County Community College Biology 225. This is the first section. Hope to do a number of these all the way through. But today we're just going to talk about the intro material, including the levels of organization, which includes cellular, molecular, things like that. All of these things that we'll be going through. And then we'll introduce some of the organ systems that we're going to be covering because ultimately the class is going to be broken down into these organ systems, and we're going to describe like the digestive system. We're going to focus on that, the cardiovascular system, that kind of thing. And then we'll talk about homeostasis because homeostasis is very important. Because really, when it comes to physiology, you can really break it down to that one word. We're trying to maintain homeostasis. We don't want our blood oxygen levels to fall too low or to get too high, which really usually isn't a problem, but it can be. And so we try to maintain that within a certain range, and that's what homeostasis is, and that's the entire purpose of physiology and studying physiology. Because when it goes out of whack, you're sick. Okay, so first of all, defining physiology. That's when we talk about function. Physiology is function. And there are ways that this can be kind of confusing when we talk about anatomy. Sometimes if you say something in a really fancy way and you talk about the tissues and that it's made of cells and it's made of these types of cells, that can be a little bit confusing. But if it doesn't address what that is doing, if we're talking about the liver and we talk about how it has hepatocytes and it has three lobes and that kind of thing, uh, then that's really talking about the anatomy. That's talking about the structure of it. When we want to talk about when we deal with physiology, we want to actually say what is it doing? What's its purpose? What's its role? What's it actually trying to accomplish? Um, Okay, so the organization, we're going to get into this in just a second more, but the cell is very important, and we're going to be talking about cells in just about every section. We're going to talk about what a cell is doing. More specifically, we're going to get into the cell, and we're going to talk about what the molecules within that cell are doing. Okay, so that's where these things come in, and I'm going to say a little bit about each one of these: molecules, cells, tissues, organs, organ systems, and organisms. You can see that this is getting progressively larger. Okay, so so if we get back to talking about physiology as a function, here's some examples. Functions versus, well, not really versus because they kind of work together, but functions and mechanisms. The cells need oxygen. Red blood cells carry oxygen to them. That's great. I mean, that's true. That is a function. Cells need oxygen. Red blood cells carry the oxygen to them. But we're going to actually get into how does it do that? Why does it do that? Um, and I guess more specifically how. Um, and so we'll get into these kinds of details. Oxygen binds to hemoglobin, and that are contained within the red blood cells. And even more specifically than that, we're going to get into kind of the structure of the hemoglobin. Of course, you won't have to draw it out or even recognize it on a test, but there are certain things. I mean, we want to answer questions like, why do we need iron? Why do people with iron poor blood? Why are they anemic? Those are questions that can be answered by understanding the mechanisms involved. Okay, so we're going to study both the functions and the mechanisms of all of these organ systems that we're going to go through this semester. Okay, so the 6 levels of organization very quickly. Chemical is the most basic. That's where you're getting into atoms, which we'll have a section on chemistry. And then the cellular levels, these molecules all come together. Atoms and molecules all come together to make a cell, and then the cells come together to make tissues. Tissues come together to make organs, and then organs will work with other organs to create an organ system or a system. And then you have the organism itself, which is what this girl is. She's the organism. Okay. All right. So and trust me, this is not all you're going to hear about chemistry, but in this section, we're starting out basic. Okay, so the chemical level, atoms are the smallest unit of matter, and then atoms come together to make molecules. So hydrogen is an atom, oxygen is an atom. When you put them together, you make water. Okay, so that's a molecule. Okay, so these are atoms, and this is a molecule. Oxygen that you breathe, that's an atom, but the oxygen that you really breathe is actually O2, and that is a molecule. It's two oxygen bound to one another, two atoms of oxygen bound to each other. And molecules can get kind of crazy. DNA, we've all heard of DNA. DNA is actually just a molecule. That's all it is. Proteins, we talk about proteins. Proteins is those are just molecules as well. They're very, very large molecules, and they have very specific functions, but they're just molecules. So they count towards this uh, molecular or chemical level of organization. Okay, the cellular. So cells come together to make molecules, molecules combine to form cells. Okay, and again, like I said earlier, we're going to talk a lot about cells, and we're going to talk about what the cells are doing. In fact, I would say that these two levels that I just discussed, the molecular or the cell or the atomic chemical level and the cellular level, are really what we're going to come down to. We're going to say, here's the kidney, this is what it's doing, and we're going to get into these very intricate mechanisms. Why? Because that's what goes wrong when people get sick. And that's really what it comes down to. That's what we're interested in. When it's working fine, if everything worked fine, we wouldn't care. I mean, we would be curious, but it's less interesting. And so it's when these things sort of get out of whack and we have to give a treatment or understand a treatment. That's where we have to know these levels. So yeah, we're going to spend some time on that. Okay. Next is the tissue level. We won't talk a lot about tissues, but there are just four different types of tissues. Nervous tissue, that sort of makes sense. Those are your neurons, the brain, spinal cord, and the nerves and neurons that are running out to your periphery, your fingers and toes. That's nervous tissue. There are also glial cells, which are also part of the nervous system, and we'll talk about that when we discuss the nervous system. Muscular, muscle cells. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. Epithelial, these tend to be coverings. Okay, so those tend to be things that are your skin. In fact, is an epithelial cell. A number of epithelial cells arranged in layers to kind of protect. When we look at the stomach, the stomach has muscular tissue within it, but it's coated by epithelial tissue. So the one that I didn't mention here, connective tissue, that kind of covers everything else. So when you look at your body and you say, you open somebody up, not to be gruesome, but you open somebody up and what do they have in them? They have blood. Well, is blood epithelial tissue? No. Is it muscular? No. Is it nervous? No. It's connective. So blood is connective tissue, bone, those kinds of things. Plus, we always see, this connective tissue that's between the epithelial. We have this nice epithelial layer of all of these cells that make up this epithelial layer. And then we have other kinds of tissue in here that's kind of connecting it maybe to the musculature below. So this might be the muscle below. So here are these nicely arranged epithelial cells, and then you have connective tissue. Okay, so that can be excreted. The connective tissue can be produced and excreted by very specific cells, chondrocytes, for instance, to make up cartilage. You have tendons and ligaments and things like that, connective tissue. Okay, and that's going to join the muscle. So connective tissue kind of falls into this category of not otherwise mentioned or something like that. Okay, all right, so then as we're maybe perhaps most familiar with, organs. Okay, so we know that we have two kidneys. If you didn't before, now you know. You have two kidneys, you have one liver, you have a stomach, you have a small intestine, a large intestine. These are organs. Okay, heart, lungs, okay, stomach. Those are all organs. And they're made up of, as I mentioned with the stomach example, they're made up of several different types of tissue. Okay, they could be made of epithelial tissue, muscle tissue, connective tissue. Okay, so they have all of those things. Okay, so now we finally end up with, and this is, believe it or not, probably the one we won't ever talk about. Oh wait, no, systems. Systems we'll talk about, but we're just going to mention it. Okay, we're talking about the digestive system, and that's it. And then we'll start talking about the stomach and the small intestine and the large intestine. We'll talk about what all of these things do. What's the liver doing? What's the gallbladder doing? The pancreas, all of those things. And so there are 11 systems in the human body. We're not going to cover all of them. We won't talk very much about skeletal system, for instance, but they're all out there. Okay, and then finally we have the organism, and that's the one we're not going to talk about at all. You are an organism. A dog is an organism. Okay, a plant is an organism. That's sort of a given. So just as long as you know that all of these things are kind of converging and working together to make up the organism, then you're in pretty good shape. Okay, so some of the ones that we'll be talking about the nervous and endocrine, musculoskeletal, with really we're going to talk about the musculo part of that primarily. We'll talk some about bone because it does play a role, obviously. The immune system, the respiratory, um, circulatory, urinary, or renal, because we'll spend most of our time with the urinary system talking about the kidneys and digestive, and then we'll finally end the semester with the with reproduction. Okay, so digestive and reproductive systems will finish out the semester. Okay, and you can see that they're all integrated. Of course, you have this circulatory system that's going around here, and it's supplying blood to everything. Okay, but it's not only supplying blood to everything. Guess what the lungs are doing? Well, they're giving oxygen too. See, O2. There we go. It's a molecule. It's giving oxygen to the blood, and then that blood is then dropping the oxygen off to things like muscles. Okay, it's being filtered by the kidneys. Now we need nutrients, so yeah, we have food coming out here from, so we eat something, and then that food, those nutrients move into our circulatory system. Okay, so they're all integrated. And then we have, of course, this is very direct, is that waste will go through our urinary system, and then that's excreted. And then we have the reproductive system, which sits down here getting blood supply, but that's very important for for reproduction. Okay, so that's an important system as well. So they're all integrated. Okay, so now to talk about this very important concept of homeostasis. People tend to disregard homeostasis. They're like, oh yeah, it's just like the body's keeping equilibrium. But then when I ask specific questions, it's like, okay, so that means that your body's internal environment, okay, maintain a relatively stable environment despite external variability. Okay, well that's a nice fancy statement. Um, so does that mean that your blood pressure never changes? No, it doesn't mean that. Your blood pressure changes all the time. It's constantly going up and down. Does that mean your temperature never changes? No, your temperature is kind of fluctuating a lot of times, especially for an ovulating woman where the temperature kind of goes up. Okay, so we have this constant fluctuation. Our blood sugar, we want to maintain a relatively stable blood sugar. But you know what? After you eat, your blood sugar goes up and then it drops again and then it gets back. So when we talk about homeostasis, we're not talking about stopping any changes. We're talking about trying to keep it within a nice range. We want to keep it within a range because when it falls out of the range, if you have very, very high blood sugar, if your blood sugar goes up and it can't go back down and your blood sugar sitting way up here, and when I talk about blood sugar, I'm talking about blood glucose, then we would say that someone maybe is diabetic. You could be type 1 or type 2 diabetic. Your blood sugar you can't maintain that homeostasis. If somebody's blood pressure is too high, consistently too high, okay, it's outside of a good homeostasis, what we consider a healthy homeostasis, which might be down here, then we say that your body is unable to maintain that homeostasis, and so we might take uh, blood pressure medications to get it back into that nice little range. Okay, so condition of balance. Okay, so that's not a bad word. Balance in the body's internal environment. It's dynamic. So that's what I've been saying this whole time. It's constantly changing. I mean, your internal environment is constantly changing. If you go outside, today it happens to be cold. If you go outside and it's very, very cold outside, your body temperature will drop. So what do? Your body will turn up its metabolism. It'll start burning more sugar, and it'll start generating heat. You might start shivering or something like that. So it's a dynamic condition. It's constantly changing, but homeostasis is that attempt to keep it in that middle range. Okay, so a narrow range. Narrow range is compatible with maintaining life, and this is kind of the example I give. Blood glucose levels range between 70 and 110 milligrams per deciliter of glucose. And so some people are walking around functioning with blood glucose levels way lower than that. And some people are walking around functioning with blood glucose way higher than that. Okay, but that's not healthy. Okay, so if you have a difficult time maintaining it within that narrow range, then we say that you're sick. Body temperature is stable at around 37 degrees Celsius. Okay, that's normal body temperature. Some people some people may be perfectly fine and normal all the time at 38 degrees Celsius. Okay, that's just their set point. Now, generally, we see people that are 37 degrees. So if you're asking, well, yeah, but is it possible to have, your homeostasis that's set higher? Yes, it is possible. Of course, there are issues, but we usually call that um, some kind of a syndrome or something like that. If someone has um, an overactive thyroid or an underactive thyroid, their body may say, no, I'm good, even though we know that that's not healthy and that's not a sustainable thing. The body doesn't necessarily know that. So a lot of times we treat things just because people have a set point that is outside of a healthy norm. Okay. Now, is their homeostasis being maintained as far as their body's concerned? Yes, it is. We just happen to know that it's not a healthy level. So homeostasis, yes, is your body maintaining a narrow range. Sometimes we say that that's a little off. Now, typically what happens is the body wants to maintain it within this range, and some part of your diet, or there may be some other problem, doesn't allow that to happen. Okay, so something could go wrong. I mean, if the beta cells of your pancreas disappear, that's where insulin is made. Well, guess what? You're not going to be able to maintain your blood glucose level in that range. Okay, so the whole body contributes to maintaining the internal environment within normal limits. Okay, and while I say that everybody has different normal limits, pretty much we're all about the same. We all pretty much have this nice narrow range. Just think about your body temperature. There aren't people running around with a body temperature of 45 degrees. It just doesn't work that way. The proteins don't work. Things don't function unless it's in this very narrow range. Okay. All right. Maybe I'll say more about that later. Okay. So what are some of the things that happens? We have physical insults, intense heat, lack of oxygen. We find ourselves in positions we might go up to, and that's actually not a bad example. We might go up, climbing a 14er. We might go up into the mountains and find out that we really can't breathe very well. And so what does our body do to compensate? Does it just say, I guess we're gonna have to live the rest of our life with just without very much oxygen? No, you start to breathe heavier, you take deeper breaths, you compensate, you try to compensate, because even though your external environment has changed, you're trying to keep it level. You're trying to keep it within that range where your cells can function, your proteins can function, everything can function normally. And so we compensate, maybe by breathing heavier. Changes to the internal environment, drop in glucose due to lack of food. If we don't eat, well, what do? Okay, our glucose levels have fallen. Well, guess what? All of your cells are very dependent on glucose. Your brain, everybody thinks, and that's absolutely true, that your brain relies on glucose. All of your cells do, but your brain especially is very dependent on glucose. Um, so what do? Do you just live with no glucose? No. You have a system. You release glucagon from the alpha cells of the pancreas. We mentioned the beta cells earlier. You release glucagon, and glucagon will increase your blood glucose level. So when you don't eat and your blood glucose levels start to fall, you'll release glucagon, and your blood glucose levels will go back up to be in this homeostasis, back in this normal range. Physical stress, or I think that should say psychological stress. Psychological stress demands of work or school. Well, that's what we're familiar with. Probably for many of you, both of these things, especially if you're taking this online, you have work, school, kids, maybe all of this stuff is draining on you. And so we tend to increase cortisol. We increase which is a stress hormone. Maybe we have a little more adrenaline or something like that, and those things can take a toll. Okay. And so any kind of a disruption, if it's mild and it's temporary, then balance is quickly restored. Okay, so if somebody pulls out in front of us and we have an adrenaline rush and our blood glucose levels go up and our heart starts beating very, very quickly, and then we say, okay, I'm fine. Then it will quickly go back to normal. But if it's intense and it's prolonged, that's what we're interested in. That could come from obviously poisoning, infections, but we say that we are sick. And then if we're not able to maintain homeostasis, if our homeostasis is so out of the norm for so long, then that can actually cause death. So that's a different way of looking at illness and death. It's your body's inability to maintain homeostasis. Okay, so how do we maintain homeostasis? Well, there are two ways: negative feedback and positive feedback. Now, I urge you to not think too much about psychology when you think of like negative and positive feedback, because it might be a little different. Okay, negative feedback. See, if I were to ask you this question, if I were to say, okay, your blood glucose levels rise and you release insulin and your blood glucose levels go down. Okay, so this high blood glucose level, and then let's say this is our norm, and this is where we want it in here, and it rises, and I say, okay, so you reverse that and you make it low again. You'll say, oh, well, clearly that's negative feedback. Now, this is not intended to be a trick question, but you might see it on an exam. If your blood glucose levels start to fall, okay, and then your body corrects it by taking them back up, let's say this is the normal range. So if your blood glucose levels fall and then you maintain homeostasis by correcting, is that positive or negative feedback? Guess what? That's also negative feedback. Okay, so it's negative feedback because you are reversing a change. You had a change where your blood glucose level dropped. You fix that change by reversing it. It's negative feedback. You're going the opposite direction. Okay, so when it's high and it goes back to being normal, negative feedback. Okay, so that's negative feedback. When it's low and it goes back to being normal, that's also negative feedback. If our blood pressure gets really high and then it's lowered, vasodilation, whatever, to get it back to normal, negative feedback. If your blood pressure drops, like in shock, and then you increase it again, your heart starts beating harder, whatever, that's negative feedback. Okay, so remember that. So, but that brings up the question, then what is positive feedback? Okay, positive feedback, I like to think of it as a snowball effect. Okay, so that means that if your blood pressure drops, let's say you're bleeding and your blood pressure drops, okay, and then your body reacts by the heart beating faster, but let's say that you're bleeding profusely, so what it does is that it's actually pumping more blood out, and so your blood pressure drops even more, okay? So that's actually a negative feedback, okay? So instead of reversing it and bringing it back up, that didn't happen. What ended up happening is it actually took it and made it lower. Now, a better example of this, and the one that you see most of the time, is with childbirth. Okay, so when your cervix, the cervix is stretched, okay, so the baby, the oversimplification, but you're just about ready to pop, and the baby's head starts pushing through, and the cervix starts to stretch, it will send a signal saying, hey brain, my cervix is stretching, and the brain will not say, oh gosh, well, gee, we better suck that baby back in. No, what it does is it actually, so the cervix stretches a little, it actually says, oh, well, so what we're going to do is we're going to release oxytocin, and that's going to cause the uterus to contract, which is going to cause the cervix to stretch more. Okay, now the cervix is stretching even more. Another signal to the brain, hey, cervix is stretching more. Brain says, oh, I know just what to do. I'm going to release oxytocin. It's going to cause the uterus to contract, and then the cervix is going to stretch even more and more until that baby pops out, and then your cervix goes back to normal, and this all stops. Okay, so that's positive feedback. Okay, so we had an example where blood pressure was low, and because your body tried to compensate but wasn't able to, your blood pressure got even lower and lower and lower. That's what I mean by a snowball effect. It just strengthens or reinforces that change. If it's low, it gets lower. If it's high, it gets higher. That's positive feedback. Okay, so try to keep those straight. Okay. And this is what I said earlier. Successful compensation, homeostasis is reestablished. Failure to compensate, illness, and death. Okay, so the study of the failure to compensate is pathophysiology, which is probably something many of you are going to be taking. Okay, so one other thing that we need to talk about, because it's included in this section, we'll talk about it again probably somewhat, we're at least going to mention it, are the different kinds of body fluids. Okay, so we've talked about the body, and we're going to be talking about cells, but it's really important to get this out right away. We have body fluids. Our body is basically, all of our cells are basically dissolved in, so if this is a cell, basically dissolved in salt water. Okay. So some people have said that the body composition is basically the same essential ionic makeup as the ocean. We have a lot of sodium chlorides and potassium and calcium and other ions within there. But all of our cells are basically contacted by fluid, both on the inside, which is intracellular, and on the outside, which is extracellular. Okay, so don't let this confuse you, because this is really just memorizing words. If we have a whole bunch of cells, and you're going to have to put a little effort into memorizing these words, sorry about that, terms are part of every discipline, then we have this special term here, interstitial fluid, which is the extracellular fluid that is between cells. Okay, so you're saying, well, what's the difference between extracellular fluid and interstitial fluid? Really, the only difference is that interstitial fluid indicates that you're talking about the fluid that is between the cells. But isn't that just extracellular fluid? Yes, indeed it is, which is why it's a subcategory of extracellular fluid. It's just talking specifically. It's saying that there is a cell right here in the area, and that extracellular fluid is affecting that cell. So that means things might be moving into the cell or out of the cell. And so the reason that I say this is because I'm going to be talking about interstitial fluid a lot. I'm going to be saying, when we talk about movement of sodium and chloride in the nephron, which is part of the kidney. When I talk about the tubules reabsorbing, all of these fancy things, I'm going to be talking about the interstitial fluid, how fluid will move. So here's let's say this is your intestine, or it could be your lungs or whatever. Let's say it's your lungs, and you just took a deep breath in. You have all this oxygen. Okay, this oxygen will diffuse across into the extracellular fluid, which is between the cells. So that's interstitial fluid, and then it will move inside the cell, which brings it into the intracellular fluid. These two words, I'm very aware, are very similar. Okay, you have to know which is which. Stitium refers to tissue. Okay, so interstitial means it's within the tissue, between the cells. Okay, intracellular, the answer's right there, inside, intracellular. Okay, so don't get those terms mixed up. All right, so most cells contact extracellular fluid bathed in a salty seawater-like atmosphere. So this is what we're talking about. Here's the intracellular fluid in here, and then there's the extracellular fluid around here. So then you have these this epithelial tissue here, and all of it's contacting fluid, all of it, anywhere in there except where you have proteins that are joining it together. It's all got to be contacting fluid. And there are very specific reasons for that. Okay, so this is basically what this is trying to show is this is overall what the body is. You have your skin on the outside, and then you have this fluid, this extracellular or interstitial fluid, and then that's entering into and out of the cells that are functioning inside your body. Okay, so hopefully all of this makes sense. Organism in homeostasis, internal change, external change, and then some kind of change results in a loss of homeostasis, and then you try to compensate. If the compensation fails, you have illness or death. If the compensation succeeds, hopefully, which is where most or all of you are right now, you have wellness. Okay, so hopefully none of you are suffering from a cold. I'm sure some of you are, which means that some virus has gotten in there and it's messing with your homeostasis, and you're trying to kill that virus so you can set everything back to the way it was. Okay, well, good luck.